What's up, family? Got another video here for y'all. So today we're going to talk about the Scottsboro boys. This is a story of 9 young foundational Black American men who got caught up at the wrong place at the wrong time. It really goes to show you how fast one moment can change one's life forever, and also how easy and normalized it is to throw FBA men under the bus. Now, this footage was taken from a 2001 documentary called Scottsboro Boys, An American Tragedy. I definitely want to give credit to the creators of that film. It's about an hour and 40 minutes long, but here I have condensed it down to just under 40 minutes. I do encourage you all to watch the original documentary. The link is in the description below. So in this video, I really want to shine light on the men involved and pay them their just due respect. Fair use, YouTube. So without further ado,
on the morning of March 25th, 1931, a freight of the Southern Rail Corporation left Chattanooga, Tennessee, bound for points west. Scattered among the cars of the freight were some 24 hobos, black and white. A few minutes out of Lookout Mountain, the train dipped into the northeastern corner of Alabama.
As the train emerged from the tunnel under Lookout Mountain, a group of whites was moving along the top of the train, and they stepped on the hand of one of the blacks and almost knocked him off the train.
The hand belonged to an 18-year-old named Haywood Patterson, who was on his way to Memphis to look for work.
We was just minding our own business when one of them said, "This is a white man's train. All you niggas unload." But we weren't going nowhere, so there was a fight. We got the best of it and threw them off. Haywood Patterson.
Word of the fight reached the tiny town of Paint Rock, Alabama, where the train was scheduled to stop and take on water. Suddenly, from the shadows of a boxcar emerged 2 white women, pale and disheveled.
First, they weren't even aware that they were women. They were wearing overalls. They identified themselves as Victoria Price and Ruby Bates. And there are conflicting accounts about who said what when, but one of the young women said, "We've been raped. All these colored boys raped us." And that was it.
For any black man in Alabama, whenever you saw a group of white men with guns in the menacing, ominous way in which people were collected in Paint Rock, Alabama, you knew you were in a lot of trouble.
There were 9 prisoners in all. One of them was 19-year-old Clarence Norris.
The place was surrounded with a mob. They had shotguns, pistols, sticks, pieces of iron, everything. The crowd comes to holler, "Let's take these black zombies up here and put them to a tree."
The prisoners were loaded onto a truck and driven to the nearby town of Scottsboro.
Crowds were beginning to form outside the jail. The rumor was that they were going to go into the jail. There was already poles outside that they were going to break the door down with.
Cars, trucks, they's coming all kinds of ways. The mob was. Bring them out of there. If you don't bring them out of there, goddamn, we come in there and get them. That's all you could hear. All you could hear over that little town.
By the next morning, the National Guard had secured the jail, while newspapers identified what one called the 9 Negro Brutes. Of the 9, only 4 had known each other before their arrest. Charlie Weems, the oldest, was 19. Eugene Williams, the youngest, 13. Willie Roberson suffered from syphilis so severe he could barely walk. Olin Montgomery, nearly blind, had been looking for a job to pay for a pair of glasses. Clarence Norris had left behind 10 siblings in rural Georgia. Ozzie Powell had been found riding alone. Andy Wright, 19, and his 13-year-old brother Roy had ridden from Chattanooga together. It was Roy's first time away from home. Haywood Patterson had been riding the freight train so long, he said he could light a butt in the wind from the top of a moving car. The two accusers also had been driven onto the rails by economic necessity. Ruby Bates, 17, and Victoria Price, 21, hailed from the cotton center of Huntsville, 40 miles from Scottsboro. They worked together in the poorest of the town's textile mills. At 21, Price was already twice married and had served time in the workhouse for adultery and vagrancy. By 1931, wages in the mills had dropped so low that Victoria and Ruby could only afford to live in the black section of Huntsville, where they occasionally traded sex with both black and white men for food and clothing.
Their lives are, in fact, a complete violation of the ideals of segregation, but the second that they accuse a black man of rape, at least for an instant, they become pure white women.
The trials of the 9 defendants for rape got underway on Monday, April 6th, in the Scottsboro courthouse. It was a traditional trading day in town, but the usual crowd was swelled by thousands more from hundreds of miles around. Eventually, the largest crowd in Scottsboro's history squeezed into the courthouse square as a brass band played Dixie and Hail, Hail, the Gang's All Here. 200 National Guardsmen ringed the courthouse to keep the crowd from rushing its doors. With the Scottsboro trials, the anti-lynching forces hoped to prove that in Alabama, the rule of law would prevail against the passions of the mob. Unable to get a lawyer in Scottsboro, the 9 accused rapes were being represented by a Chattanooga real estate attorney hired with $60 scraped together by the parents. The defendants had just one 20-minute meeting with their lawyer, during which he urged them to plead guilty.
The courthouse was full of people, and they were jumping about the seats with pistols. Nothing wasn't a black person around nowhere. Everybody was white, but just us 9.
When they announced the verdict of guilty, people ran out, and the judge was trying to bring order, and as soon as the word got outside, the crowd outside went crazy.
The trials lasted 3 days. All 9 Scottsboro defendants were convicted of rape. The jury could not decide whether to sentence 13-year-old Roy Wright to life in prison or death. All the others were sentenced to die in the Alabama electric chair. The Scottsboro defendants, now convicted rapists, were taken to Kilby Prison near Montgomery, the pride of the Alabama system. 2 to a cell, the boys looked out on 50-foot walls topped by gun turrets on each corner. Their first night in Kilby, the boys rioted, tearing up their bedding and hurling their food through the bars. Guards rushed their cells and beat them.
The cell door banged open. They beat on us with their fists. They kicked and tramped on our legs. The sheriff said to me, "See that gallows? If you don't quieten down, I'll take you around to that gallows and hang you myself." Haywood Patterson.
When help did come, it was from the most unlikely of sources, the Communist Party of the United States. By 1931, the Communists were a small but dynamic force. Opportunistic and organized, they seized on the Depression as proof of the inevitable decline of capitalism and the rise of a workers' paradise. For years, the Communist Party had devoted special attention to the American South and to Southern blacks in particular.
It is only the Communist Party which day in and day out fights for every demand and need of the Negroes in the terror and lynch-ridden South.
Only 3 weeks after the Scottsboro trials, the Communists launched their first demonstration on behalf of the Scottsboro defendants.
200 communists undertook to march down Lenox Avenue through the center of Harlem yesterday afternoon in defiance of the police. 15 minutes later, when 20 policemen had replaced their nightsticks and the screams of the women in the crowd had died down, the sidewalk was strewn with communist banners. The New York Times.
In June, lawyers from the International Labor Defense, the legal arm of the Communist Party, visited the boys in Kilby, trying to raise their spirits and secure control of their defense. The ILD lawyers dressed as farmers to elude the suspicions of Kilby's wardens.
They put on overalls and straw hats and put a straw in their mouth and went down to Alabama to see the Scottsboro boys.
They had been in a very bad psychological condition. We brought them cigarettes, chocolate, and they were scared, but they were delighted to see us.
But the boys remained deeply confused by the appearance of white men from the North bearing promises of liberation. It was not until a young organizer visited the parents of Haywood Patterson and the mother of Ozzie Powell that the communists finally secured control of the defense. In November 1932, communists took their public protests to the steps of the Capitol, where they were routed by the police. But inside, their lawyers were appealing the Scottsboro verdict before the Supreme Court of the United States. The justices considered whether in the Scottsboro trials, the boys' legal defense had been so inadequate that it violated their rights to legal due process. By a vote of 7-2, they concluded that it had. Alabama authorities immediately resolved to retry, reconvict, and execute the 9 defendants.
The communists realize at this point that they've got to show the world that these defendants are actually innocent. What's the best way to do that? Get the best criminal lawyer around.
In the early 1930s, the best-known criminal lawyer in America, after Clarence Darrow, was New York's Samuel L. Leibowitz. In January 1933, Joseph Brodsky, one of the leaders of the International Labor Defense, asked Leibowitz to take over as chief defense attorney. But Leibowitz was wary of entanglement with the communists. But if one thing was more important to Leibowitz than political principle, it was his personal reputation. And the Scottsboro affair was fast becoming an international cause célèbre. The second trial of the Scottsboro defendants had been moved to Decatur, a town in northeast Alabama. Jury selection took place under heavy security. The 12 jurors ultimately chosen to sit in judgment of Patterson included a shopkeeper, a barber, a clerk, and several farmers. All of them were white. As the state prepared to present its case, newspapers reported the mysterious disappearance of Ruby Bates, who was rumored to have been kidnapped or even killed. Every effort by the prosecution and defense to find her had come up empty. More than ever, the prosecution would rise or fall on the testimony of Victoria Price alone. As the trial resumed, the tense atmosphere in the courtroom was heightened by a spring heat wave. The state called to the stand Dr. R.R. Bridges, the Scottsboro physician who had examined Price and Bates hours after they'd been taken from the train. As expected, he confirmed that he had found semen in their bodies.
Leibowitz now cross-examines him and essentially turns him into a witness for the defense.
Leibowitz asked the doctor if the girls had shown any signs of a struggle, bruises or scratches. He answered, no. Had the girls been hysterical, breathing heavily, with elevated pulses? No. Had the sperm he had seen in his microscope been moving? Again, no.
The spermatozoa were non-motile. That means they were dead. And they would not have been non-motile if 6 Negroes had ejaculated themselves into her an hour to an hour and a half before she was examined by the doctor.
Leibowitz next called his star witness, Lester Carter, to the stand. Carter testified that he and a friend had been with the 2 girls the night before the fateful train ride.
Victoria Price said she knew where we could go and see fun. Take a walk, for instance.
Go ahead. What happened?
We walked up the yards till we come to the hobo jungles.
What occurred in the hobo jungles that night?
We all sat down near a abandoned lake of water where there was honeysuckles in the little ditch. I hung my hat on a little limb and went to have an intercourse with Ruby. By firelight, I saw Victoria's boyfriend had intercourse with her.
This is what happened. It wasn't that they were raped. Victoria Price, Ruby Bates, and their 2 boyfriends had sex, and that's all it amounts to.
Throughout Patterson's trial, the other 8 defendants had been kept locked away in the Decatur jail, unaware of the proceedings. Now, Leibowitz brought them to the courthouse under heavy guard. Inside, Leibowitz called each to the stand in turn. Each denied having ever touched Victoria Price or Ruby Bates. The last to take the stand was Haywood Patterson.
Did you have anything to do with a white girl?
I didn't see any girls on the train.
You are a colored boy. Would you dare rape a white girl?
No, sir.
Haywood Patterson, did you rape this girl?
No, sir.
With Patterson's testimony over, many thought Leibowitz would rest his case.
What Leibowitz does is pretend that he's about to rest his case, and then he quietly goes up to the judge and says, I'm going to have one more witness.
Ruby Bates had spent the months before the trial in hiding, as far from the media glare and the clutches of the prosecution and defense as she could get. She had made her way to New York until finally representatives of the ILD tracked her down and convinced her to return to Alabama.
You testified at Scottsboro that 6 Negroes raped you and 6 Negroes Victoria. Who coached you to say that?
Victoria told it, and I told it just like she told it.
Did Victoria tell you what would happen to you if you didn't follow her story?
She said we might have to lay out a sentence in jail.
So Bates essentially says that she made the whole thing up because Victoria told me to make it up. She said if I didn't make up the story, then we would have to go to jail.
But Ruby fell apart on cross-examination. Knight pointed out that either she was lying now or had lied 2 years earlier in Scottsboro. Ruby became flustered. Knight hammered away at her.
He asked her where she got her pocketbook, where she got her hat, where she got her coat. What was she doing in New York? How did she get from New York to Alabama?
To each question, she answered, the communists.
Aha! The only reason she's doing this is because she's been bought and paid for. She told the truth the first time. Now she's lying for the money and for the clothing.
The jury, one reporter said, smelled the North on Ruby.
By the time she gets down off the witness stand, what should have been the most effective witness for the defense, as one of the jurors said later, we never even considered her testimony.
Summations began the next day. Wade Wright, one of Knight's co-prosecutors, opened with an emotional appeal. He ridiculed Bates's fancy New York clothes and called Lester Carter Carterinsky.
He turns to the jury, points his finger to the jury and says, show them that Alabama justice can't be bought and sold with Jew money from New York. Of course, immediately, Leibowitz is on his feet.
He objected. He wanted to call for a mistrial immediately. Of course, it was overruled.
In his closing argument, Leibowitz called Wade Wright's summation for the prosecution a hangman's speech.
What is it but an appeal to prejudice, to sectionalism, to bigotry? He was simply saying, come on, boys, we can lick this Jew from New York. The question here is whether even this poor scrap of colored humanity will receive a square deal.
Finally, Leibowitz said of Price's testimony, it is the foul, contemptible lie of an abandoned, brazen woman. At 1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, Judge Horton gave the case to the jury. The 12 men filed out of the courthouse less than 2 weeks after they had been sworn in. Haywood Patterson, nearly forgotten in the courtroom hubbub, passed the time with his mother on a bench outside. At 10 o'clock the next morning, word came that a verdict had been reached. Guilty. And the sentence? Death by electrocution. Patterson conceded no emotion as he sat at the defense table. But Leibowitz could not hide his disappointment. In the months following the verdict, he began to appear at Scottsboro rallies in Harlem, where he promised to carry on the struggle in the South.
I will fight to my last breath to send these boys back to their parents and to their loved ones.
From his home in Brooklyn, Leibowitz prepared a motion asking Judge Horton to overturn the verdict and order a new trial. Judge Horton had retreated to his farm in Limestone County after the verdict. But Leibowitz's motion now forced him to confront his own doubts about the case. On June 22, 1933, in a crowded courtroom, Horton set aside the guilty verdict. He ordered the Scottsboro defendants to stand trial for the third time. The communists seized on Scottsboro's notoriety to reach a wider audience. They sponsored the mothers of the defendants on a national speaking tour. Janie Patterson, who had never traveled more than 100 miles from her home, led a protest march on the White House. Ada Wright, mother of Roy and Andy Wright, embarked on a 6-month tour of Europe, ending in Moscow, where she spoke before crowds of thousands. On many stages, the mothers were joined by Ruby Bates. Cast out of the South for her testimony in Decatur, Ruby now apologized for her lie and proudly proclaimed herself a communist. Once again, Patterson would go first, but this time, Alabama authorities were taking no chances. Attorney General Thomas Knight, also the state's prosecutor, engineered the removal of Judge Horton from the case. and named in his place 70-year-old Judge William Callahan.
Judge Callahan was from the old school in many ways. I think much less widely read than Judge Horton, much less sensitive to these issues, and in fact, to an extraordinary degree, a creature of his own prejudices. So that from day one in the trial, he becomes, in effect, another prosecutor.
Repeatedly, throughout the trial in Callahan's courtroom, the judge frustrated Leibowitz's defense, overruling his objections and excluding crucial evidence to his case.
At one point, Attorney General Knight wanted to voice an objection, and Callahan said, "Sit down. I'll take care of him." And he looked at my father and he pointed his finger. So after that, Attorney General Knight knew that it wasn't necessary to form any objections. Callahan would take care of it.
The jury deliberated a day before reconvicting Patterson and sentencing him to death for the third time. Norris's trial followed quickly with the same result. Leibowitz managed to postpone the trials of the other 7, but with little hope of a different outcome. All 9 boys were sent back to Kilby's house. By this time, their hope was fading. Kilby Prison was closing in around them like a shroud. Despite contributions from around the world to purchase new clothes, food, even musical instruments, the boys' international notoriety singled them out for continual torment. When Charlie Weems was discovered reading communist literature, guards dragged him from his cell and beat him until he begged for mercy. At one point, O.Z. Powell slit the throat of a sheriff's deputy with a homemade knife. A second officer then shot in the head. Though he survived, Powell was never the same. Patterson and Norris feuded constantly over gambling debts. Norris once stabbed Patterson with a prison shank.
They started to turn on one another. They started to fight with one another. They grew more hopeless about their situation.
Back in New York, Mr. Leibowitz tells of the appeals.
The appeals are now being rushed to the Alabama Supreme Court. I have every confidence in the world that we shall win there. In the event that we do not, we are going right on up to the United States Supreme Court in Washington.
Leibowitz soldiered on with one last appeal to stop the scheduled execution of his clients. In each of the Scottsboro trials, the boys had faced an all-white jury, a clear violation, he believed, of their right to equal protection under the law. In February 1935, the Supreme Court of the United States heard Norris versus Alabama, which would determine whether Alabama had purposely excluded blacks from their juries. To prove that they had, Leibowitz brought with him the huge jury rolls from Decatur. In them, he had made a startling discovery. Of the prospective jurors listed, all were white, except for a handful of blacks whose names appeared to have been hastily scrawled at the bottoms of several pages. In a landmark decision, the Supreme Court ruled that Alabama had deliberately excluded blacks from their juries and yet again overturned the guilty verdicts. Exhausted, embarrassed, and near broke from trial after trial, Alabama's once united front regarding Scottsboro finally began to crumble.
A lot of Southerners begin to say, look, this thing is more trouble than it's worth. And there really are serious questions here, and maybe the best thing to do is to settle this case.
Grover Hall, editor of the Montgomery Advertiser, once one of the most ardent defenders of the Scottsboro verdicts, began to wonder if something had not gone terribly wrong.
The advertiser knows, all of its readers know the whole of this sordid, sickening story. Scottsboro has stigmatized Alabama throughout the civilized world. We herewith suggest and urge that the state now move for a decent, dignified compromise. Nothing can be gained by demanding the final pound of flesh. Throw this body of death away from Alabama. Grover Hall.
Hall quietly began to lobby for an end to the Scottsboro prosecutions and the parole of its defendants. State officials listened, but made clear that one condition would have to be met. Samuel Leibowitz would have to go. For Leibowitz, the notion that he shared blame for the convictions of his own clients was almost too bitter to swallow. But Leibowitz had no choice but to give in. As Alabama began the fourth trial of the Scottsboro defendants, he stepped aside in favor of a Southern attorney. With Leibowitz gone, Alabama quickly convicted 5 of the defendants, but it abruptly dropped the charges against the other 4. Olin Montgomery, Willie Roberson, Roy Wright, and Eugene Williams.
2 of them were 13 years old at the time the incident took place. One of them was blind. One of them had syphilis and simply couldn't have had sexual intercourse. And basically the state said, all right, we'll give you those.
Woody, Alabama, and you better watch out. The landlord gets you gonna jump and shout. Scottsboro boys, they can tell you what it's all about.
The 4 were spirited out of Alabama in July 1937 after 6 years in jail. They arrived in New York the next day. Leibowitz was so overcome that he took off his straw hat and punched a hole through it. For a moment, the freed defendants were celebrated as heroes. They were taken on a speaking tour and booked into the Apollo Theater, where they sang, danced, and took part in a reenactment of their trial. But just as suddenly, the fanfare died down. The boys drifted back into obscurity. Their pleas for help to their former sponsors frequently went unanswered. For the 5 defendants remaining in Kilby, the release of the 4 others only heightened their despair. Their supporters continued to push for their release. How, asked Grover Hall, could the Scottsboro defendants be half guilty and half innocent? By 1941, the Alabama Parole Board had met 3 times, each time refusing to free the prisoners. The boys, now grown to men in prison, received fewer and fewer visitors and watched as the Scottsboro case began to disappear from the nation's consciousness. But the world's forgetfulness proved to be the Scottsboro prisoners' greatest ally. As the rancorous attacks on Alabama ended, the state at last bowed to reason and exhaustion. In the end, it was not letters, marches, or editorials, but time alone that brought the Scottsboro affair to an end. In November 1943, the Alabama Parole Board met for a 4th time. This time, it voted to parole 31-year-old Charlie Weems after 12 years in Kilby. 2 months later, Andy Wright was released. Then, Clarence Norris. In 1946, Ozzie Powell, 33, was let go. Only Patterson, The man whose defiant pride had marked him from the beginning as the most visible, the most hated of the Scottsboro defendants, remained in prison. Sullen, vicious, and incorrigible, according to the Alabama Parole Board. Patterson had become a creature of Alabama's prisons. He was sent to Atmore Prison Farm, where he worked in the hot sun for 12 hours a day, chained to other prisoners. Throughout everything, he would later write, Scottsboro haunted his dreams.
I laid on the top bunk, in a way, still feeling I was on a moving freight. Nothing was standing still. I was busy living from minute to minute. Everything was rumbling. I dreamed bad dreams with freight trains, guards' faces, and courtrooms mixed up with the look of the sky at night. Haywood Patterson.
On a hot afternoon in July 1948, Patterson slipped away from Atmore with 8 other prisoners. With dogs in pursuit, he waded through streams for days and was harbored at night by sympathetic black families. Finally, he hopped a freight north to Detroit, where his sister and her family were waiting. The last of the Scottsboro boys was free. The year after Judge James Horton overturned the verdict in the Decatur trial, he was defeated for re-election and would never again serve on the bench. On the top of a campaign speech, he had scrawled a note to himself, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Samuel Leibowitz never won a victory in an Alabama court for the Scottsboro defendants, but he did save their lives. With the Supreme Court decision in Norris versus Alabama, he also set in motion the integration of Southern juries, which would make possible many of the civil rights victories in later decades. In 1941, Leibowitz was appointed to the bench in New York, where, with a new vantage point, he became a passionate advocate for capital punishment. Victoria Price disappeared after the last Scottsboro trial and was presumed to have died sometime in the mid-1950s. Then, in 1976, she surfaced to sue NBC for broadcasting a television movie that portrayed her as a prostitute and a liar. The suit was settled quietly for what for NBC was a pittance, but for Victoria Price was more money than she'd ever known. She died for real a few years later, still insisting that she had told the truth. After their release from prison, most of the Scottsboro defendants led troubled lives in the North. Haywood Patterson killed a man in self-defense in a bar fight and died in a Michigan penitentiary at the age of 39. Andy Wright wound up in Albany, New York, where he was again falsely accused of raping a white girl. This time, he was acquitted. His brother Roy, youngest of the defendants, served in the Army and married. In 1959, convinced that his wife was cheating on him, Roy killed her, and then, with his Bible by his side, shot himself. He is buried in a neglected cemetery in Chattanooga. Beside him, in an unmarked grave, lies his brother, Andy. Of all the Scottsboro defendants, only Clarence Norris made a life for himself in the North. He broke parole in 1946 and fled Alabama, making his way to New York. Assuming his brother's name, he got a job as a sanitation worker, married twice, raised a family, and began a fight to get a full pardon from the state of Alabama.
He wanted the world to know that he was an innocent man. He had a responsibility now to make sure that the world understood that those 9 defendants in 1931 were innocent, and that it was racism, only racism, that in fact forced them to spend all those years in prison.
On an October day in 1976, Norris received word that Governor George Wallace had pardoned him.
Mr. Norris, this is your pardon, full pardon.
He was very emotional when he received the pardon at the press conference, because he remembered getting off that train with those other 8 guys. And here he was, getting his pardon. He's alone, and I'm sure he could feel them around him. I'm sure he could feel their presence. And he thought about them, why me?
I have no hate, prejudice against them, creed or color. I like all people. And I think all people accused of things which they didn't commit should be free. I wish these other 8 boys were around.